work having been
First,
done.
let me thank you for your time. All right. This is an effort that's just beginning, looking at the redevelopment of New Brunswick, with an emphasis on speaking to the principals, recording oral histories. In parallel, we're doing archival research in the Rutgers Library, the Brunswick Library, et cetera, et cetera. What will come of all this, besides these recordings, will be some type of product that's to be defined. Probably some type of presentation wherever, and there may be some articles and further discussions on it. Now, you've seen our outline, and it's just that. It's just that. And actually what we want to talk about, which is something that I haven't been able to find in doing so far in the archival research, is Rutgers and all of this. So I guess if we could maybe start with that. I can
With
imagine.
Rutgers and all this?
Right.
Well, could I make a statement first?
Please. This is your discussion.
I just a very brief statement. I'd like to say that I never have been quite as enthusiastic, unqualifiedly enthusiastic about oral history as a lot of our colleagues. I just you distrust the written record, but I distrust memory, and that's just a preference for my own. It's been 25 years since I served on New Brunswick Tomorrow and was involved in the revitalization, and so my memory has huge gaps and has areas filled in that really are not based on fact, probably. All right.
But I know you have great anecdotes.
So with that disclaimer.
So noted.
Okay. All right.
Offset by your insights, however.
Rutgers. Let me say before Rutgers that the revitalization of New Brunswick, I feel very strongly, was a Johnson & Johnson enterprise. And it was not, and Johnson & Johnson was not like the university. It was not a democracy. It was from top down. And the committees operated pretty much that way too. Maybe we can talk a little later about how New Brunswick Tomorrow operated, but it was not, the agenda was not a collegial agenda. We were presented, I think, in fairness. Well, let me talk about that a little bit later. As far as the university was concerned, it was a hard road, and my background was urban history, and so I felt very strongly about it, and I also felt very fearful for the university because of the scattered campuses and the fact that the downtown separated Cook Douglas and College Avenue. And when I first came in 1969, and in 10 or 15 years earlier, New Brunswick had been thriving, 2 big department stores downtown, a lot of activity, and the decline was sudden. And when I came, people simply would not come, and who didn't live here would not come to New Brunswick at night. Well, there was no reason to come to, State Theater was a pornographic theater, and there weren't any restaurants. There weren't even ethnic groups here other than African Americans at that time. Mexicans hadn't come. So I saw a disaster ahead for the university, or enormous expense in somehow or another acquiring land and moving. It was my training as an urban historian. It wasn't that I was particularly prescient about anything. But I really had a very hard time with the administration. The faculty really wasn't involved. They didn't ask much of the faculty at that time. And Blasting was good. I had his ear. But the director of budget, Marvin Greenberg, resisted every move in that direction. His job was, protecting the finances of the university, and he saw it as risky. So, he was doing his job, but it was still an obstacle. But in any case, I I was on the New Brunswick Tomorrow committee from its.
And I should just expand out some. There was an urban planning faculty. Were they at all on this radar? Or not?
I talked with them from time to time, Salah particularly, and Salah was chair then, and I would talk with Salah. Not as I taught history of planning before that it became involved with social issues. Before planning wasn't. Planning was physical planning. I taught at Ohio State, and it was changing, particularly here, Harvard and here in Penn. And so I talked a lot with Shaw, but New Brunswick Tomorrow didn't do physical planning. It was not.
Right.
It was program planning. And so, I just remember talking with him frequently and occasionally others about the problems that we were having.
And the students, the planning students.
And the planning students, it was a New Brunswick Tomorrow operation. I have to emphasize, I spent my life in academia, and we talked about reorganization of the university. But that's the kind of process I was used to. So being thrust into a hierarchical environment, and Johnson & Johnson was playing the bill. They were listening, but they were running the show. And John was running the show. And he should have been given great free rein as he was, because they would not have done it without John. I'm convinced that it was. John is the only vice president in probably 20 years who hadn't moved out to Burgersville or someplace. He stayed in Highland Park, and he still won't move across the street. The place his name is. His wife has an apartment there. But she goes home on weekends. So it really was John. And you talked with him yesterday, so
right.
You know his personality. I think he's a fascinating man. He's very complex. He's very modest in many ways, but he's also very forceful. And it was their operation, and their resource was the American Cities Corporation.
Right.
And if you could get Leo Molinari, is he still alive?
I think he is.
If you could somehow or another go to him or get him to come here.
There
Of
are
course, he had
exist too.
one of the questions had to do with transferability and also with other cities that were doing things that he's the one to answer that, because that, of course.
And we've been able in the archives, like, to go back to the original American Cities report, which then led to the mayors and Schiff, which then led to Raymond Parish and Pine, a series of stuff. But if I could go back, and again, I don't want to, if I'm interrupting at a bad time.
Could I just ask one question, but don't forget yours?
Please.
Do you have unlimited access to the J&J archives relative to New Brunswick Tomorrow and DevCo?
Not yet.
We haven't tested that yet.
Okay.
What we want to do is to exhaust what's publicly available, and then start saying
make them give them up, because it'll make them look better.
No.
Okay, sorry.
I guess flashing back, and I was at Rutgers about that time.
Sure.
All right. I guess the other American universities that were in urban areas, like I guess University of Chicago with the neighborhoods around there, and Yale with the neighborhoods around there. I guess there seemed to be more awareness of we're in the city, and if the immediate neighborhoods are not stabilized, we have an issue. In fact, University of Chicago then helping foster some of the urban renewal efforts in those cited neighborhoods to stabilize. From what I'm hearing from you, it was somewhat off the radar in Rutgers.
Yes.
That we're in an urban.
David, can you give me an example? I was at Boston University before coming here in 1969, and I was the acting director of what they call the Metro Center. It was trying to coordinate the universities to respond to Roxbury. Roxbury was burning at the time, and all. And yes, there was a lot of awareness there and a lot of talk. not too much accent. But don't you think the size had a lot to do with New Brunswick? We weren't a city, really. And certainly the inner city had virtually disappeared as far as a functioning center of this metropolitan New Brunswick. But it was only 50,000, and you give me Chicago and Boston and other places. Do you know of other cities this size?
There is, which actually was a plus and a minus.
Yes.
You know, in part, you could wrap your arms around in New Brunswick. It's harder to wrap your arms around.
John mentioned going to Cincinnati, but he said that they did things wrong. They just did a whole bunch of housing without involving any of the
but
community.
Cincinnati's a real city.
Yeah.
Not to diminish
No, I understand.
New Brunswick, but New York always has and always will. You know, however, that's the city, and this is.
Well, even
I think
within,
that's my impression is the difference, and we were sort of out of the loop of that. And again, I always felt that my strong suit was the divided campuses. If Rutgers had been exclusively on College Avenue, they could say, we got plenty of land across the river. If we ever have to move, we can, which is what most universities have done, is move away. And most corporations, you really have to give J&J enormous credit because they took a risk with their stockholders. They put an enormous amount on
But before I lose the thought on the divided campuses, the fact that it was divided, so first one, there wasn't this critical mass right in the middle of the urban, and two, they were at that time expanding into other campuses, so the immediate urban downtown New Brunswick was less important. Is that some of the things?
Well, it was risky. Nobody knew it was going to succeed like it did.
Right.
And most people were actually at the university. They were skeptical that it would happen. They
For good reason.
They didn't want to look at the future because it was all dark for them.
Yeah.
So I think those are the reasons. So I don't mean to denigrate Rutgers, but honestly, you know how a university operates. We all do. People are in their disciplines and they're focused in their concerns, but they have primary responsibilities, and
I think also land ownership plays a role because universities like Penn, Harvard, Yale, they owned downtown land and they were capable of purchasing it.
Yes.
Even today, we see that difference between how Rutgers engages in development. We don't own the land, but we entice, we often have to entice partnerships. So it's a different kind of investment in the city.
Why couldn't we own land?
Pardon me?
Why couldn't we have owned that land?
Well, I guess we have to open up.
One of my efforts, there's a wonderful building next to the People's National Bank that has 3 stories. It has 6 apartments, 1-bedroom apartments, each with a wood-burning fireplace. What a beautiful, and store space downstairs, just off, walking distance in the buses and so forth. The most beautiful place we could have had for visiting faculty members. Short-term visiting faculty members. $250,000 on the market for 3 months. I thought, oh my God, it'll ruin me, but I'll sell my house and buy it myself. University wouldn't touch it.
I see.
They wouldn't touch it. Now that's not a big investment, and that's prime downtown.
Right.
Come on.
Yeah.
And it was that caution that prevailed. I had another little thing with Marvin about summer school, and Ed Klaustein said to me, he said, Kenneth, don't be a little more merciful with him. He said, he keeps the place running. Well, that was our attitude, we don't want to mess with the budget and so forth, and Marvin doesn't. So there were missed opportunities. It wasn't just that we didn't historically own the land.
I see.
We didn't do anything to
At that time.
protect our interests.
Okay.
And I still grieve over that as visiting. Wouldn't you love to be a visiting faculty member with
Sure.
a fireplace in your 1-bedroom apartment in downtown New Brunswick today?
So if you can just take us through so we get the historical flow.
Yes, okay.
So we have J&J is kind of saying we need to do something, and American Cities comes in and they form New Brunswick Tomorrow. But again, if you can just take us through Rutgers and all this, I mean, and yourself.
There
and all
wasn't
this.
any Rutgers in all of this.
It was kind of, it was you.
Yeah. We did, you know, I was able to get the bookstore downtown. I insisted that Mason Gross be downtown. We got the Arnold Constable building. And, you know, there were a few ventures like that. But in terms of any concerted Board of Governors policy about making a commitment to it simply wasn't in the works then. They just were not aware. And J&J, everybody in American industry seemed to be fleeing the cities and moving to rural campuses. And that would have been the logical place for Johnson & Johnson to go. It would have been a lot less expensive. And again, I credit John with persuading that. He was very, I don't remember his exact title at this point, but he was very powerful within that group. And he had the ear of Dick Sellers, who was president during much of that time.
Right.
And
It
Dick
was
Sellers,
actually, he has a very bland title. That didn't really reflect.
Yes,
It was
yeah.
Vice President in charge of administration.
Yes.
I thought it was
I
Vice
remember
President
one
of
of the most-
Corporate Affairs or
I
something.
don't want to ramble on this, but one time they published, right before John was retiring, they published the highest paid corporate executives in New Jersey, and they listed John as having $14 million the year before in salary and perks, and he was humiliated. You saw him yesterday. You
Yeah.
can imagine how it took him years to live that down.
So what I'm hearing is it really wasn't on Rutgers' radar. It was kind of you because of your personal interests and
Yes.
professional interests. Ed Blousting being somewhat
He
supportive.
was not unsympathetic, but he had many challenges during the time. You know, you can only have so many.
So
balls in
it
the air
wasn't
at one
very
time.
high on his radar.
Reorganization. We had huge budget problems during some of those years, and another example was the State Theater. I thought the State Theater would be wonderful as it is, as it's become. And it was a porno movie. And so I would talk with Marvin. Marvin would say, well, it's not acoustic sound, it's just a shoebox. And I said, Marvin, Symphony Hall in Boston is just a shoebox, and it's the best acoustic environment in the country, probably. And besides, it's not a shoebox. It's kind of octagonal. So I called the fellow who at the acoustical architect at Columbia who redesigned Avery Fisher, and they gutted it according to his plan. And I called him and told him our problem, and I said, you know, really, I think they were converting a lot. I think in Cincinnati, it already a number of old vaudeville houses or movie houses were being converted. I said to him, you know, what can we do? How can we find out if it's at all acoustically feasible? If it's not feasible, let's forget it. But how can we find that out? And he said, well, you can't afford me, but I will give you 3 formulas. And if they all fit, forget it. If they don't, then you have a chance. Then that's the time, and I'll give you some names of people to call. So I got in touch with the plant manager, Bob Totten, at the university, who was a devout Baptist. And I said, Bob, we have to go to the State Theater. He said, the porno theater. And I said, we have to go. And he said, well, can't we make an appointment? I said, Bob, you know better than that. We make an appointment as Rutgers people. Think what's going to happen to the price if we decide we're interested. I said, I'll buy the tickets and you back in. You don't have to face the screen, and then we can do these measurements. So we did, and they didn't fit. So now, ultimately, it took John Heldrich persuading Dick Sellers to, out of his own pocket, buy the State Theater, buy the Porno Theater,
Wow.
and hold it until DevCo had the resources to turn it into a concert hall.
Now, you mentioned some of the things Rutgers did in large part because of your impetus.
Well, it sounds like
that
I'm on a
was
vanity trip.
okay.
I'm embarrassing myself.
The bookstore.
Yes.
The bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, if I recall, the bookstore used to be by the library.
It was in a shack by the
shack by the
library.
library.
Right.
And what was there other? Okay, so clearly that you needed a new facility.
Yes.
Were different places
Yes.
considered, and then maybe talk a little bit about the bookstore. I know where it landed up, and that it was precisely in the Ferrin deck because.
Well, it was because the Ferrin deck was being built.
Mhm.
I said, and the bookstore, they were talking about expanding the bookstore, and I said, the bookstore is really basically hopeless where it is. There's no way to make a permanent addition to that building. But put it downtown, and it's, okay, let's do that. You know, that was feasible. It was relatively safe and easily accessible to students.
So you had to negotiate that with DevCo, I guess, right? Because Fair and Deck was a DevCo project.
DevCo did the Ferrin deck.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And you mentioned Mason Gross, which clearly was
I
a
said,
statement
you're gonna be downtown,
to be
and
downtown.
Jack Bettenbender didn't like the idea, but I said, sorry,
Jack was the
we have to.
So
we have
other locations were considered other than the downtown? I mean, that.
They may have.
Okay.
But was it, we had to get into,
Right.
somehow or another, we had to show some sign of, participation in it.
Now, was that pressure, so to speak, to show, was that in part accentuated because Rutgers was on NBT and people were saying this is what we're doing, or was that more yours?
No, it was, I don't remember it is. There was certainly no internal pressure from Rutgers, as I've said, to be involved. And J&J was, well, maybe we can talk about that a little later. But again, it was their show.
Mhm.
And I was very concerned at times about it being their show. And I was very concerned about the fact that it seemed to be a focus on downtown commercial activity. And even though they were trying to help the variety of projects, trying to help the lower income citizenry, I always believed that we ought to try very hard early on to get to gentrify. That there had to be an educated, reasonably well educated, professional class of people who were involved to make a balanced community. And so I was interested in, the housing for visiting professors and for that. And that was not their timetable. And I was confused by it. And now in hindsight, I understand it a little bit.
When you say confused by it?
I was confused by the fact that they seemed to be totally involved in, I said, if you don't have a population support that those commercial establishments you're trying to bring in, then that's a mistake.
So this residential and housing just wasn't on the J&J radar?
It was what?
It was not on the J&J radar?
Not middle class, and I'm not,
Except
not
on the-
middle or upper middle class.
Except in the Hiram district, but maybe that was a bit later.
That was later. That was much later.
Okay.
That was several years later because I wanted to live there. I wanted to be one of the first ones down there, and I went to Washington to see Alan Voorhees,
Right.
who owned that land at that time and was going to develop it. And it was 10 or 12 years later that they actually built it. But the first places in Hiram.
So was Alan involved in at all because it was on his land and getting
No,
that
it was just that
credit?
he had grown up. He and Ralph and John
Right.
Heldrich were very close. They had all grown up in Highland Park, and they all were very sentimental about the New Brunswick, greater New Brunswick area, and wanted to
Right.
help. And I've forgotten other things he did, but he worked with DEFCON and bought up all of that land for the original site around the Frog and the Peach.
Right. Right. Right.
All right, so again, you mentioned the bookstore and the Mason Gross. Do you care to speculate about what an alternative history could have been, with Rutgers saying urban and New Brunswick is very important to us, and we're going to put Livingston not on Livingston but in the down. Just what might have been an alternative course of action, and what consequences do you think it might have had?
It would have been very difficult. I was dead wrong. There's certain enterprises just have to be. I'm very sympathetic with Houseman and his problems. I think that if we hadn't had a Houseman, we wouldn't want to visit Paris today. You may disagree, but
No, I
so I think it sometimes takes a very focused effort by a relatively small group, and particularly if you're coming out of a hierarchical organization, as most corporations are, that, and maybe I can jump into that now, and that'll sort of answer your question. The meetings that we had were run by John and a staff of 3 or 4 people, and American Cities, and their work was done behind the scenes. And they brought to the committee, which was a representative, Roy Epps was on the committee. I think Roy Epps, the votes were always unanimous for everything that was presented. Roy Epps, one time in the 12 years or so that I was on the board, voted to abstain. But that wasn't really, our purpose was to help them, but not to influence them to change course unless they were clearly going in the wrong direction. And so we were, I really hesitate to use the term, but we were a rubber stamp committee, and we were intended to be. And can you imagine having a lot of people from Rutgers on a rubber stamp committee? It sounds condescending about faculty. I don't mean it that way, but I just think universities are very different kinds of organizations, very necessary, and corporations are another kind of organization. And to really have an impact during those times, we weren't making sacrifices. J&J was, so J&J, I felt, should have the say. They were the ones who were running risk. We weren't running risk with our constituency.
So as an urban historian, how would you evaluate the denouement of New Brunswick Tomorrow and DEFCON?
Today?
Yeah. We look at the city and we...
I don't know of another city in America that's had as great a success. But I'm not terribly well informed. I've been retired for 10 years. But no, I don't know of another city that has been as successful. They made mistakes. But I think the timing was good. I think they had to get some kind of income base, and then the timing was right for the housing, even though I was deprived of it.
And when you say as successful, just how much has happened, and
yes, and the fact that people are much better off here, and I think that they, displacement, particularly of neighborhoods, is it's a very traumatic business. Some people live down where the tower, the J&J Tower is now. They lived down there for generations, and they were scattered, throughout New Brunswick, and that was difficult. But I think that you can say that that across the board, the population is much better off.
because the city is economically that much
Because the
stronger.
city, and they ended up building a lot of low-income housing, good low-income housing. You know, it was very dangerous to come to New Brunswick. People just didn't want to come over here from, you know, people, farmers were afraid to come here.
Mhm.
So I think it's, you know, again, I think, you know, every effort like this makes mistakes, but I think overall it's very impressive, and I think the community owes a huge debt of gratitude to J&J and the others who did it. I really, you know, I've been emphasizing J&J, but I mean to, I really believe that was the single driving force.
Do you feel that the city administration at different levels, how would you assess the mayor, the, you know, representative? How would you they weren't quite rubber stamped? What were they?
Pat Sheehan?
Pat
Sheehan.
Pat Sheehan worked for Johnson & Johnson, and she was a middle of the road Democrat. And I think most of them are most of the officers at J&J are Republican. But she worked well within that organization, and actually John Lynch worked pretty well with him. You probably should have gone to jail then as well as later.
we hope to talk to him. He's
out?
coming out.
This month.
Just for
month.
you?
Well,
Congratulations, David.
I guess they'll release him early, but he has to talk to us. There's very little literature written on New Brunswick, but this very small body of literature plus things discussed in terms of some of the critiques. You know, you've acknowledged how much has been accomplished in the city economically is that much better off, and the cultural center has become a regional draw, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess some of the critiques is that there was only a patina of neighborhood involvement. You know, there was Roy Epps was on the board, and they had some people from representing the churches on the board, but you weren't getting a bottom-up input into this redevelopment process. Is that a fair statement?
No, nobody intended for that. I mean, it was not stated, but hey, your representatives on the board, look at these ministers and Roy Epps and so forth, you have a voice there. But no, it would have been a waste of time. That really sounds, I'm shocked that I say that
talk
now.
a little bit
I
about
would have
that?
never
Because-
said that 30 years ago.
Well, can you talk a little? And again, I've been around a lot of years, and you know, as a student,
Okay.
I would have reacted differently, and now.
At the risk of repeating myself, I just think that they perceive as an organization. They came out of an organization that was hierarchical.
Mhm.
They came out of an organization that had a history of trying to deal with the world with integrity. I think that was about the time the Tylenol scare came. I don't know if you remember that or not. They found somebody put arsenic in the Tylenol bottles in a couple of pharmacies in Chicago. And they moved right in, and they recalled everything, and they made public announcements, and they handled it as well as any capitalistic concern that I know of has handled a problem. And that's been their history. But they are hierarchical. And so you do what you're accustomed to doing. And they probably were advised by American cities. This is why I think Leo Molinari is so important to talk with. He's very candid, and he's a very decent man. But I suspect that he also recommended, you want to share information, you want to have broad factual input, but you want to keep focused.
But I'm also hearing from your perspective, it's not just that's the way it happened, but that it almost needed to happen that way.
Yes.
To have realized what was realized.
I would make the comparison with is two totally different kinds of institutions. The corporate structure of J&J and the university.
Mm-hmm.
It took us really took us closer to 15 years of educational process. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the existing system? How can you keep the strengths and eliminate the weaknesses? 15 years.
This is on the
That was
reorganization.
pretty good for a university, I think. Don't you?
When you say 15, that's related to the reorganization?
To the reorganization of New Brunswick, of the disciplines. In contrast, J&J, hierarchical, they get the information they feel they need. The leadership makes the decision.
Carries it out.
Now, John has talked about Richard Sellers and how it took, I think John feels it took him a few years to get Richard Sellers to buy into the idea of doing this.
Yes.
But then apparently...
But when he did, when John finally convinced him, he was there all the way.
And then he became the head of DevCo. He retired from J&J?
He retired, and I think, I never kept up too closely with DevCo because it was the other. I did a bit, but they overlapped somewhat.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm sure that doesn't surprise me.
And then
It
Sellers...
was John. It was John Heldrich.
Right, and Sellers was the one who then bought the State Theater, so he became heavily involved in it after having not really...
Well, not as heavily involved, but it, as I recall, it was several $100,000, and it was out of his own pocket.
Right.
Do you have a sense of what might have changed Dick Sellers' mind? I mean, yes, besides... it sounds like there was something that opened him up to. We didn't quite get that.
He told us that Leah Molinari had said to him, "He's not ready yet."
Yeah.
And so I don't know what happened between the "he's not ready yet" and then he called
John
in John and said, "I'm ready to do it."
I guess we didn't quite realize.
Yeah.
We didn't quite realize that we had that gap to ask him.
I mean, one could speculate. Things started to happen, and you saw some progress, But if I can go back to where, all right, I'm going to wear now my urban planning hat.
Okay.
I understand, again, good contrast, between university, kind of democratic committees and what have you, and hierarchical. Okay. And in fact, let's acknowledge that, that you needed sort of a hierarchical corporate structure to get things done. All right. But have there been more balance in terms of what was done? Have there been more, so you're saying this model worked. Okay, I'm saying looking back, with the benefit of some hindsight, had there been more community participation, it may have slowed the process, and it may have made it messier, but you may have had more of a balance of what we look out the window now and see. That housing a little earlier, affordable housing more than there is, because basically it took 15, 20 years before you saw housing, and basically you don't see affordable housing in the downtown, and the affordable housing that was here, Memorial Homes got moved. And there were good reasons, that was a failed model of public housing, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm now on my urban planning platform, saying, pretty much, most of the consensus is saying in order to get a plan that makes a city holistic and work, you have to reflect the different interests. One of those interests are less advantaged, minorities, etc. I'm just trying to hear a little on the other hand. I hear what you say. The corporate structure made it work more efficiently, etc. But even looking back with the benefit of history and hindsight, I'm not really hearing.
I think you're trying to put words in my mouth.
No, he's
Come on. I don't do oral histories for a living. I'm not. I will zip at that point. I'm just.
No. I've given a lot of thought to that, and I'm very surprised at the change in myself, in my view of myself, because those are exactly the questions that I would have asked at the beginning, and maybe I'm kind of jaded because 15 years at the university wore me out. I don't think there's any of that. It goes on in the minds of men. But I really, that's such a complicated question because it deals with, a lot of it deals with money. Where are you going to get the money for the low-income housing if you don't have some kind of tax or commercial base, you know, for the income to build that housing. And how are you going to persuade very nervous people from the 60s and 70s, upper middle class professionals, even at Rutgers? Where did Rutgers people live? How many of them lived in New Brunswick? 3, I think.
Yeah.
Warren and you know, that's fine, but you know, we don't want our kids, et cetera, on dangerous streets. And I think that when you balance it out, you have to deal with the art of what is possible. And also, I think with an enterprise like that, you have to have momentum. And I think that if we had taken a side trip to build some, frankly, it would have had to been token. And I think it's better not to do it than to have. I really do think it's better to do that than not have it. Then there will be pressure that will be lost. So you haven't done anything for lower income people, you know. And that voice began to be raised along the way, and I think that provided. So, am I skirting the question, David?
No. Having reached on the cusp of turning 60 at the end of the month, there's a lot of. You know, I'm not the younger planning student, so
Yeah.
seeing everything in black and white.
Yeah.
Look, another side of the redevelopment. Clearly, new construction was embraced as opposed to trying to preserve some of the stock.
Okay.
You know, Hiram Market, various controversies, etc. Your thoughts on that? You know, was that the way to go?
Yes. Now there I did differ,
Okay.
and I differed strongly. I said you can't tear down the city and rebuild it and have it viable in 20 years or 50 years. You've got to have a sense of continuity. And they did that with the churches, but I think it wasn't because of continuity. I think it was just they didn't want to stir up those congregations, which were pretty powerful. But for example, on Church Street, when they tore down that whole block, and I don't think the design was good, and I think it's proven not to be good on.
You mean the Kilmer Square area?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
The mall.
It's commercially not worked.
Right.
It's poorly designed for that. It's wrong, and I thought it was wrong in the beginning. But when they did it, I protested because there were some there's no great architecture, but there were some interesting buildings. And the 3 buildings that are the first on Church Street across from the Episcopal Church, I said those make a unit, and I said it's not going to cost you much to preserve those
That's
3,
where
and they'll be
Old Bay
across
is.
from the church.
Yeah.
So you'll have a sense of historical
Context.
continuity with those.
Yeah.
So they said, okay. I made a lot of noise about it. They said, okay. And John agreed to it. Well, I found out indirectly from some of their henchmen, the director of New Brunswick Tomorrow, the paid the hired kind. I found out that they had gone back on that commitment. And so I was really annoyed that I hadn't been informed. And so I got in a shouting match, I guess, with him. And John was in the room. He said, no, wait a minute, what's going on here? And I said, you made a commitment. And I said, I think that is, I thought it was very important. It was important to make an issue up. You made a commitment, and now you're backing out on it. And so
Was it Ted Hargrove?
no, it was his predecessor,
Okay.
Abdullah.
Abdullah.
So he said, well, the contractor can't afford it. And I said, well, he shouldn't have signed the contract. He should have done his figures before he signed the contract then. And so John said, well, it's okay, we'll take care of it. But I felt very strongly about a lot of that, and I felt that more was torn down than needed to be. I felt that Marvin Greenberg said, oh, we were destitute at the time. He said, we'll put a concert hall in the budget. We could do a nice concert hall for 10 or 15 million. We were scrambling to not lay off faculty. And I think that's much better to have those older
The State Theater.
facilities there, to give a historic diversity. So, yes, I would say that was one of the things that I felt. The faculty housing, if they had saved that, like the Church Street could have been an interesting kind of, it was a 19th century street.
What about the Hiram area, where the older buildings with lofts, where there are now those townhouses?
A lot of those really were not rehabable. It was
Okay.
it had been in serious slum condition for a long time.
That's where I took the cooking class with David Willems.
That's what?
David Willems had a loft. He
Yeah.
was a sociology student.
Yes.
He did catering and stuff, and I
Yes.
took a cooking class in one of those lofts shortly before it got torn down.
Yeah.
But the insides of some, I guess, were fine. Others, I guess, were
Yeah.
dilapidated. But they did preserve the buildings where the Frog and the
Well, a
Peaches.
lot of that was, they preserved what?
This block where the Frog and the Peaches,
Yes.
those buildings.
Yeah.
What about the design of the J&J headquarters building?
It's ugly. But, people disagree on aesthetic taste.
Because it was touted as a tower in a park and a park in a city, and of course it's very non-urban.
Oh, yeah, you're right. And that's an important point. And the walls around it are not sittable. And that's part of what causes the difficulty across the street. A large part of across the street is just simply design, I think. But it's just a thoroughfare, and there's nobody there.
Well, to go with that for a second, John described the impact of the small Kilmer Park on the corner. He
Yes.
felt that the community responded to it symbolically. Do you have any thoughts on how
I like
open
it.
spaces
I like it
were?
then.
Oh, well, yes, I know. I was.
I mean, it's,
Yeah.
you can peer through the bars and see it, but it seems to be locked.
All the
You
time.
never, and you never know when it's going to be locked and when not. So if
Right.
you want to say, I'd like to go down and sit in the park, or what, you don't know whether you can get in or not. And then across the street, the walls are deliberately high to keep loiterers, I guess, away.
Do you have the sense that at the time that this was unfolding, that the headquarters were built, that the park was opened, I guess in the other order, that people either at the university or in the city were aware of these kind of public space questions and saw...
They didn't live here.
Pardon me?
They didn't live here.
Yeah.
They were interested in Highland Park, where we lived. No. I mean, it was enough to have your discipline and then your kids and then your local home community, and you just didn't have time.
Right. So there really was no kind of watchdog group for
Nobody
questions
told
of
you about
open
it.
space or public
No,
life like you see in
no,
other
no,
cities.
Yeah.
At that time, there were groups that were advocates of accessibility. In the '60s, accessibility, gathering places that didn't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, you had very few Rutgers professors, like Tony Nelson,
Yeah.
who lived in a loft right
None
behind it.
like Tony Nelson. Wasn't he wonderful?
He's still here.
Is he?
Oh, yeah.
He must be
Actually,
older.
now lives in the suburbs, which I just
Yeah.
find very. I think in.
Yeah, but in a converted greenhouse
Whatever.
on a roof.
But again, it was because he was very urban.
Yes.
You did not. I mean, one of the. It's always hard to figure out why. You had these few Rutgers professors, but basically the Rutgers professors didn't really relate to New Brunswick.
Even in your department, where was Salah? He was in Cairo.
Or
Princeton.
Or Princeton.
Yeah.
I mean that.
And
the planning faculty.
There really wasn't a sense of hope. And again, J&J could have, I suppose, you've got lots of money and lots of PR people. They could have said, we really want you involved, and so they could have had some kind of public relations campaign with Rutgers faculty.
Right.
invited them. They're always happy to go for drinks and so forth. And they didn't want that. That was not their role. So,
But as to
and
why,
I think that was true. The planning, most of the planning people have their special, as we all do in universities, have our special niche, and we needed to spend our time there, and then in our own hometowns.
this is a general observation, the very limited connection between the planning program and New Brunswick pretty much continued. Forget on affordable housing, displacement, whatever you want to talk about. You want to talk about technology, downtown redevelopment, arts revitalization, which is going on in front of your nose here, is not picked up by the planning program. I think I was one of the few people who periodically would run into Brunswick studio, and it's not like it was particularly demanded. And after a while, I stopped because I didn't know if I wasn't getting grassroots support to it.
Yes.
Well, Briaville did some things. She wrote some articles on it.
Who did?
Briaville Holcomb.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Right.
Did you, a related question is, when you observed your objections to the demolition, and what kind of allies did you have with that position? Did you feel you were a lone voice?
Oh, John.
So there was no,
John.
So John was, okay.
If John hadn't, the rest of that board would have
Just,
would not have understood. They wouldn't have responded.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact,
So it's John.
I'm
And
just
John
trying
had
to-
made a commitment, and I made such a argument for it ahead of time that he knew that it was, that I felt very strongly about it. They were very good about how they knew how to keep the peace
I'm
with
just
carrots
trying-
and sticks.
Any other examples of where some things got preserved? I mean, I can't think immediately of.
No, these
Small victories.
and I don't know what happened along George. There are a lot of those buildings there, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I didn't feel strong. If they had threatened to tear down People's National Bank, I always thought there was a certain charm about it on that
Right.
corner of Church.
Right.
But it never came out.
Well, I think in part George got preserved because there wasn't demand to build there. And in fact, when there was demand, when what was it, that UMDNJ or whatever
Right.
unit, when they wanted to come in fact, it was demolished. But I mean, it was more
Right.
preservation
No,
because there wasn't
that's
demand,
that was
not
not an issue
preservation
with
as
anybody.
a
And
policy.
it was because of history.
There
Well,
is now.
we were trained, weren't we?
There is now with the Gateway building. There was a group who tried to preserve, this is on the corner of Easton and Somerset. There was a Rafferty's restaurant at that corner and New Jersey Bookstore and all that. That's all coming down for a large high-rise
And that's
building
where?
by the train station. North of it's up
On
Easton
Somerset?
Avenue. Across from the Easton Avenue
Yeah,
dormitory.
I really regret that. My son, when he was at Rutgers, lived in the third floor. I was always concerned about fire, but delighted that he's living in there. There were about 4 or 5 houses
that's
there.
right, a small
And then the
streetscape,
corner
right?
building, and all of them had their own kind of,
Right.
they were not great architecture, but they were
Yeah.
a sense of the history of,
Right.
Streetscape.
of Rutgers.
Yeah.
Those are coming
Just
down.
every bit as much as Old Queens.
Right. But there was a group to protest that.
From
But
the
that was-
university?
No, I think it's historic. Historic
It's a small
Society
group
or something.
that I'm sure would have almost no practical effect because.
Yeah.
Why didn't you join them?
Why
Why didn't you join them and embrace that?
Some of the other, your perspective on some of the other major players at the hospital, like where were they? And
No. It was they had they tried to develop grants, and I think they helped the hospital a lot in that way for special programs. And that was obviously it was a two-pronged effort because of the tradition of the company and Robert Wood and so forth. But was not involved in that. I'd like to just make one point that occurred to me is relations with J&J, between J&J and the university were not great when I came here. As a matter of fact, Mason Gross had quarreled with whoever was president of J&J, and they weren't even speaking. And Mason Gross didn't give a damn. He was a wonderful president, but you know, he was thoroughly academic, and we don't need him. But right before Mason was president, the J&J had promised us the building on George and Hamilton, the big building.
Both their older building.
Yeah, the
right,
older
older
building.
headquarters.
They said, you know, we're going to be building within the next 15 or 20 minutes, 20 years, we're going to be building a new headquarters somewhere. And when we do, we'll give that to you. That never happened. Part of it was, I don't think it was, I don't know why they didn't give it to us, but I would say that everybody was under great financial stress during that time that the building went up. Our budget was awful. I mean, times not as bad as this, but we thought they were.
How about the university and the city, you know, town-gown relations?
With Lynch?
There wasn't anybody here.
Lynch.
There wasn't anybody here for most faculty members to talk. I mean,
Oh,
So it just wasn't.
it wasn't. They didn't come to. They were. First of all, a lot of people were really afraid of New Brunswick. Even in the daytime, they didn't want to come here. And they did have. It must have been the mid-'60s. And you know, another person maybe to talk to would be Eric Krebs.
Oh, yeah.
Eric Krebs had a little it was on Albany Street, a little theater in about I came here in '69, and it had been going on for several years.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that there was one there.
It's what?
There was one in the downtown.
Yes,
Then he later became the George Street Playhouse.
Yes, that was Breck West.
Okay.
And there was another name for it even before that. But I think Eric started probably in 1965 or 66.
Okay.
He was downtown, and there wasn't anything else downtown other than Breck West. Then there was a supermarket on the other side of George Street by the railroad tracks, and he took that over, and that's when it became the George Street.
Oh, okay.
And that was probably, I was on the board then, about 1962 or 63, and he drew people downtown. His productions were interesting and drew a lot of university people down, and they were on the board. Voorhees were all for one time or another, and gave a lot of money to them, and John. And so it was a one viable cultural effort downtown. Later, Crossroads was much later. But I think Eric would be interesting to talk with, because he had to, you know, he was a survivor. He had a faculty position at Livingston. And I think he's still around. He has an apartment in New York, I know.
And he has a house in Highland Park.
He still has the house in
Yeah.
Highland Park. Well,
I think so, yeah.
oh, by all means, talk.
Okay. Another person who did become involved was Bill Wright.
Yes.
Now, Bill worked at Rutgers in
Yes.
facilities.
But he also became the first director of the Cultural Center.
Right. So how did that happen? I mean, since no one else seemed to be involved from Rutgers, at what point did he?
They hired him.
But had he been involved in
No.
NBT or DEFCO or anything
No,
else?
no,
Oh, okay.
I don't think so. I don't know anything.
Okay.
No, I think that he was an excellent planner.
Okay.
And had a nice aesthetic taste,
Mhm.
and was interested in cultural activities. Now, last time I heard, he was still in. He went from here to Michigan State to head up their cultural activities, and I think he comes to New York from time to time.
Oh, yeah?
I'll tell you who can, do you know Virginia Record?
Mm-hmm.
Virginia would have his, she keeps contact with him, and she's moved to Virginia, but you could call Albert
Okay.
and find out where Bill is, because they were close friends, and I know kept in contact. Keep in
Okay.
contact. But I think that would be, you know, he's very candid, and
Right.
and it was tough times.
Right.
Can we talk some on transferability? You know, your,
No.
all right.
I don't, you know, I don't, where, David? It's an
I guess-
interesting question. I didn't mean to be glib. But I think any place that wants to take a look at possible reorganization, has some hope of doing it, ought to look at New Brunswick Tomorrow. I always said that. I said, this is going to be a great model for people to look at. But in terms of transferability, I think, you know, to have John Heldrich and a corporation like J&J, both of them are, I think, kind of unusual. And, you know, to have exactly the pieces in place.
And the hospital and the university.
And the hospital, and ultimately the university. I hope we're doing a lot better now.
And the county seat. I mean, if you wanted to
Yeah,
say,
exactly,
what were some of the...
And size.
And size.
And size. It's a
yeah.
manageable size. And, you know,
Okay.
when you think about Boston or Chicago, you have to think in neighborhoods, and even then it's kind of overwhelming.
Well, according to John, Ed Blaustein was the last Rutgers president who took any interest in New Brunswick.
I think that's true.
So,
And I didn't mean that he didn't, but he just had, you know, that was my job. It wasn't his.
right,
I was on that committee.
right. But certainly Fran took no interest in it.
No.
And it doesn't seem that
And
Dick
I tried
is.
hard with him, because after I was provost, I went over there as academic vice president for
Mhm.
5 years. And he asked me to stay on for a year or two, and I tried to work, and it just wasn't, that was not where he was.
Right. And I don't know that Dick has taken much interest in it either.
So, Dave, that's not a really good answer, but
You've been very good in identifying some people, and others, you know, where do we go further? And other, you know, some other people to talk to perhaps, and you know, where do we go in terms of documents? I mean, I mentioned some of the things that we
have you thought about talking with Tony Nelson?
Yeah, no, I think
Certainly can.
absolutely. I mean, that would be.
He has a perspective, to be sure.
That's for sure.
But, no, and it would give you, he'd share that with you, and I think it would be different. The fellow who had, what was the place next to the Frog in the Heat? Oh, he died, didn't he?
The J. August Cafe?
Yes, he died.
Did
He
he?
was, that's too bad. He was a graduate of your school. What was his name?
I don't remember.
But he had 2 or 3 restaurants downtown, and was
Right.
he was another survivor.
Who was my student?
Who was your student?
Yeah, I just got.
He was your, well, you trained him well. He was very bright.
Yeah.
Glenn Patterson was a former. Glenn Patterson, who was head of the city's planning and economic development for like 20, 25 years. He also came out of the program. But again, not to interrupt your chain of thought, of just some people to.
Did you keep any files, or
excuse me?
did you keep any files from these early years?
See, they took all of our files to Alexander. I don't know
Yeah.
what would be in there, but what I think a major key is to somehow or another persuade J&J to open up their archives to you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's long enough. And
Right.
you could get John maybe to help with that. If John says it's fine for you to, if he told whoever is responsible for this, J&J, that that he'd like to see them open.
Right.
I think they'd do it.
And he has his own archive, basically. It seems
John
clear
does.
John does.
He's letting you have it?
Well, no, he didn't say no. He did not say no to the
He
idea.
wanted to clean it up a little, and then Allison said, "Don't throw out too much."
He didn't say no to
We
the
all know,
idea.
we historians know.
What cleaning out means.
What cleaning out means.
It's like, no, stop. He didn't say no to the idea, for example, of one of the library sciences graduate students helping him organize and catalog his archive. He didn't say yes,
Yeah,
but he
right.
didn't say no. So there is an opening.
Well, John's not going to rush
And
into
then
it.
I think there are, I think he said, well, we could look at Brunswick Tomorrow annual reports from the year on. Well, that's one level, but that's a sanitized,
Right.
as opposed to more internal memos and
Yes,
deliberations.
yes.
He also
exactly.
mentioned-
And so
yeah.
that's why John's might be, but he may have sanitized it, not conscientiously, just to be prudent.
Mm-hmm.
There's also
He's not a historian.
there's also Andy Baglivo he mentioned. Andy, he said he would
Ah.
have files.
Yes. You ought to talk to everybody you can. He has a perspective. He was a hired gun. That really was his role the whole time I
PR.
knew him, and
Yeah.
he was John's hitman.
Your thoughts on, or did you work much with John Lynch?
Not a lot. He was caught. We mentioned his predecessor.
Pat Sheehan.
Pat Sheehan, I think, was much more attentive. I think John Lynch, they got John Lynch to do a lot of things simply because they were who they were, but he had a lot of other things going on. And so did she, but I think she genuinely, well, I don't want to, I can't say what his motives were. I just never had a sense of his priority. It wasn't secondary, but it was equal to other involvements.
And I think Pat, I don't know, now Betsy Garlotti is Pat Sheehan's daughter, right?
Who?
Thanks. Betsy Garlotti.
And I don't know her.
Betsy Garlotti worked with Carl Van Horn for a while. She worked for Florio. She's now either head of or is on the city council in New Brunswick.
Is Pat alive?
I met her a few years ago through Betsy.
Might see if because she would be very good.
Yeah,
And it might be an interesting contrast. with
right. But we
John.
could
It
find
might
that
not.
out from Betsy. Yeah.
Could you describe a little bit your sense of the New Brunswick Tomorrow meetings? What some of the kinds of social topics and issues and priorities?
I think those should come from the agendas, because that's
Okay.
what it was all about. If you saw the agenda, that's what we saw, backing materials, and we said yes.
Okay. Because it's interesting how the so-called social was separated from the physical planning, because
Well, it overlapped. It overlapped
Yeah.
a lot. We were, in effect, consulted about a lot of the physical. I didn't put consulted in quotes, but there was discussion. I don't mean to say that we just sat mute around the table, but it was, and I think probably I was the only one who felt a little strange, because it was hard to walk away from the university where I lived to shift gears.
Right.
It wasn't heavy-handed. It was very subtle, very clever,
Mhm.
but controlled.
What would be your thoughts on what should be an outcome of what we're doing? What do you think would be, some end products here that you think
Well, as I said, I think that I would hope that it would result in some kind of, are you well-funded, may I ask, at this point? Or?
We're starting to be.
Are
No,
you?
we've got funding through the university as sort of a seed grant. And then Chris Folio has her own redevelopment company that she's giving money to us, and Michael Farewell, the architect, is giving some funding, and we've now approached J&J and DevCo for some funding, but we haven't heard from them yet. But there are a bunch of other people.
I would think
that-
there might be foundations interested in, say, of supporting a publication,
Mhm.
because it's, in our current climate, you know, people are interested in
Right.
trying to stimulate development. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the question.
No,
What would be an outcome?
You know, some outcomes.
Oh, the
from
outcomes,
this,
oh, yes. Oh, I would very much hope that some kind of publication would
Mhm.
result. Because again, I think that while it's not an exact model for any other place, I think it could be very valuable for a lot of efforts.
Mhm.
And another person, if you get Leo Molinari, I think that's an important question for him.
Mhm.
You know, what two communities look at when they're trying to feel their way into
Right.
some kind of effort.
Do you recall that at the time that this was underway, there were particular cities that came up as comparisons with New Brunswick?
No, there weren't any.
There really weren't.
Because of the size, again.
Mhm.
The size and the fact that we really are a suburb of Manhattan.
Was Hartford small, bigger?
John had mentioned,
Hartford
you know,
is
this greater
significantly
Hartford
bigger.
process.
The what?
There was something referred to as the Greater Hartford process,
Yes.
which brought in the Hartford insurance and other
Yes.
executives. So I
Yes.
think they were comfortable with that, but there wasn't anything all that unique about the group.
Right.
This was going on in 50 different cities. You know, you
Yeah.
bring some of the corporate and the
Mhm.
But
usual
did anything
suspects
happen?
to try to do something.
Did anything happen?
Well, Hartford is pretty much a basket case, so I
Yes.
guess that tells you something.
Yeah, John said
Yeah, exactly.
he was
That's why I
inspired by
said,
the
you know, I
rhetoric.
don't, there were
Right.
other efforts,
Right.
but I don't know any other effort that was successful to the degree that New Brunswick Tomorrow was.
You mentioned briefly that you thought that it was a very successful effort, but there were some mistakes.
Yes.
What do you think the mistakes
Well,
are?
I think the lack of sense of continuity in architecture.
Mhm.
I think that too much was torn down.
Okay.
I would have liked for them to have had more low-income housing and housing for professionals
Right.
earlier. But I put a caution on that. I don't know whether that was financially feasible or, that was a...
Mhm.
And I think that something ultimately has to be done about Kilmer Square, facing Albany. It's a dead zone.
What do you think could be done with it?
Get a decent architect. So look at Lincoln Center. I live right by Lincoln Center, and it's going to be glorious. And
Right.
it was really pretty miserable, particularly 65th Street.
Mhm.
The entranceway in with
Mhm.
that ramp and the cars and everything. I was there just yesterday afternoon. It's going to be lovely. It's just opened up whole new vistas. You think of a huge European square now.
Right.
And just coming out, it cost $1 billion and some odd dollars. Well,
Right.
that was mostly for Alice Tully. But still, it's wonderful.
Actually, it could have been worse. The original plan for Kilmer Square was a mall. In other words,
Yes.
an interior mall.
Yes,
Mm.
At
yes,
least
yes.
they then opened up
Exactly.
stores.
Yeah, that would have been
That's interesting.
maybe someday still, because they just,
But that wasn't them. If you look at the downtown, Atlanta redevelopment with the big hotels. It's just a concrete dead
Yes.
space. If you look at the hospital redevelopment here, it's really dead space.
Right.
When you're driving down that main street,
Mhm.
there is nothing there.
Yeah.
I know DEFCO has commented on that, but they can't get the hospital to do other than exactly what they want to do.
Hmm.
And this is DEFCO trying to be a little sensitive to streetscape.
Do you recall a presence of any architects or landscape architects as outside consultants, any individuals who
I.M. Pate
played
designed that awful headquarters building.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No,
Some
that's-
people
it's-
like that, I guess.
Well, we heard a little bit from John about Pei also being kind of a informal master planner, being taken up in a helicopter, saying this should go here in New Brunswick, that should go there. I will say, based on what I know about other cities at this time, it strikes me that the absence of a active kind of local or regional, or even just a strong outside consultant, architect or landscape architect, jumps out right away. And so the fact that people only remember Pei is fascinating.
Well, he was a household name.
Yeah, but I mean, why would, I think you're thinking more of larger cities, New Brunswick was plain vanilla master plans, done by very plain vanilla. Take the last master plan you did and then just put New Brunswick on it. I mean, but that was
You're talking about American cities.
Feller and Feist, there were a number of firms that you went to that would just.
Yeah. And I doubt if had much to do with the final design. I think it may have been a disappointment to everybody. Johnson & Johnson's intentions were good. He was expensive.
Yeah.
They wanted to make a contribution.
Right.
And so.
And they stayed.
And they,
Right.
yeah.
There still isn't a vibrant retail life on George Street. I mean,
Who
people
lives
who
on
live
Livingston Avenue
Livingston,
now?
who lives, well, there are still professional offices along there.
Yes.
But when I drive in, because I come down Livingston, I would say it's largely a Hispanic population on Livingston.
My accountant is down past the high school. I still
Mhm.
come out here for him.
Mhm.
And I said and I often walk to the train station after I finish there. And so I said, she said, don't you want us to, where are you going? I said, to the train station. She said, well, we'll drive you. And I said, no, I'll walk. She said, oh, you can't walk along Livingston. It's broad daylight, for heaven's sakes. And she was very upset. She said, oh, it's very dangerous. No, you can't do that. And another secretary in the office piped up and said the same thing.
Really? And I'm sorry, where is it?
It's about 3 or 4 blocks past the high school.
You mean the school up 2 or 3 blocks here? There's a middle school or something. High school's way up at the end of Livingston.
Well, whatever, maybe it's a middle school.
Yeah, I
So
think
by
so.
the public library, across from the.
No, it's way up Livingston,
Oh.
maybe 20 blocks from here.
Oh, okay.
So then it could be,
Yeah.
the high school.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's,
I think it's largely a Hispanic population, from what I see when I drive.
But is there a lot of violence in part of this?
Well, I mean,
Livingston
Livingston Avenue, which was threatened with a lot of interesting buildings, basically became stabilized by professional use.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, that.
But there aren't middle class residents?
There are some.
Are the Hispanics low income all? What
I
is
don't
it?
know.
I think
What's
it's,
her problem?
It's low and lower middle.
Yeah.
And a lot of, you don't, the census.
Well,
is-
have middle class professionals moved back to New Brunswick in the last 10 or 15 years?
In the condos.
How many faculty members live in New Brunswick?
I'm
What
su-
percentage of them?
I'm
10?
sure very few.
Very few.
And from what I understood talking to the developers, like one reason why the townhouses in Hiram Square didn't immediately sell is people weren't willing to buy in New Brunswick. When they built, Steve O'Connor was involved, a student of mine. was the first rental building that was built on 18. The rental building rented because people weren't making a commitment.
Right.
They were leasing for a year. And after they had that, then it became more acceptable for more housing and ultimately some
Right.
ownership housing.
Well, now what about a place like Heldrich House?
I mean, I don't get a sense of a Rutgers that Rutgers
The person
people
at the
are-
top of it in the penthouse is a restaurateur down along Route 1 and Trey Piani down closer to the Forestall Village. There was a big piece on him in the Route 1 magazine. So it's not even somebody who works in New Brunswick,
Yeah.
but he liked a more urban setting instead of living in Princeton.
Is it full?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Don Crookerberg, who passed away a few
Yes.
years ago, bought one of those Hiram
did he?
buildings,
Yeah.
yes.
Sounds nice.
So he lived there and walked to and from work.
But also in part, you couldn't get past the educational system in New Brunswick. You know,
Yeah.
and you know, Rutgers people with children it would never be on the radar because of the public school system.
Right.
I'd say maybe 5 or 6 of the faculty members in the history department, for example,
Did what?
have home. 5 or 6
Oh.
in the history department have homes in New Brunswick.
Oh, do they?
Yes.
Yeah.
They'll
And
often
it's how
also
big
have an
now?
apartment
About
in-
40?
Probably a little higher. A
Oh,
little higher.
40.
And some with small kids. I mean, the charter schools. It's got a toehold. It
Yeah.
sounds like it's a little better than.
Well,
it
that's
was.
5 or 6 more. It was Warren Sussman was the only one.
Oh, yeah.
And he finally moved out. He finally gave up
Hmm.
Right.
in the late 70s.
Hmm.
Every
I
little
heard
bit
it-
counts.
I heard an interesting story from Omar Boreai, the realtor,
Yeah.
who has a realty office on Livingston Avenue. He said when Ed Blaustein first came, I don't know how he got to know him, but Ed wanted to purchase a house on that block right off of Livingston. It's one of those blocks that has the big round concrete balls on a, sort of an entranceway. And Omar said, well, as president, don't you get housing? And he said Ed hadn't even been aware that the university had housing for him and that he had a house somewhere when he first came for interviews or was hired. So he was going to buy a house right off of Livingston Avenue and then realized, well, I don't need to buy a house. I'm going to get a house from the university. It seemed like an odd story to me.
That is a very odd story. Particularly because his father-in-law or her father-in-law, Ruth Ellen's father-in-law was on the faculty at Douglas.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and her mother lived in Metuchen, so they were very much, she was a physician.
Yeah. That sounded odd
That
to me.
sounds
but-
very odd to me.
So
And he is president of Bennington.
Right.
It wasn't that he was, inexperienced.
I know. But
and
apparently he
he
almost-
knew that ordinarily a president's house was a social gathering
Right.
place at a university.
Right. Well, this was a large house off of Livingston Avenue.
Wow.
So any further thoughts or people?
No, not at the moment, but I will keep that in mind if I'm not, and
Sure.
I'll, call you or send you a note if I think of other people.
Okay.
Thank you. This is really.
Well,
I think
it's one po-
you bring important perspective wearing multiple hats.
It's one point of view.
Right. That's
You might think about Ralph.
good. We're going to talk with
Are you?
Ralph.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I talked with Alan, his son, yesterday about setting up something. So maybe next week we'll
Okay.
get together with him.
His long-term memory is very good,
Yeah.
and that's what we're
That's
most
what we're
concerned about.
Right.
So,
Right. Great.
all right.
Okay,
Well, thank you. This has been
Thanks
interesting
for
meeting.
Time and coming in, and
It's all good to see you.
we're gonna we'll of course share everything we produce with you. And
One thing I do need to have you do is